Welcome to Sinister Macabre. Today, we're covering a case so horrifying that it defies belief. This case is not just a tale of abuse, but a shocking example of how evil can lurk behind closed doors, even in the most unassuming of homes. Brace yourself, because the details of this story are truly disturbing. A story of unimaginable cruelty and neglect that resulted in the tragic death of Lacy Ellen Fletcher. Lacy Ellen Fletcher was born on May 25, 1993, in the small town of Slaughter, Louisiana. As a child, Lacy was described as sweet and shy, with a bright smile that charmed those around her. For most of her early life, everything seemed normal. Lacy attended public school, participated in activities, and appeared to have a promising future ahead of her. Her parents, Sheila and Clay Fletcher, were active members of their community. They were known to be involved in local events and regularly attended church, presenting themselves as a loving, respectable family. But beneath this veneer of normalcy lay a dark and sinister reality. As Lacy grew older, her life took a dramatic turn. By the time she reached her early teens, she began to withdraw from social interactions. Her parents claimed that Lacy suffered from severe social anxiety and that she refused to leave the house. This anxiety reportedly became so overwhelming that she stopped attending school altogether, and her parents decided to homeschool her instead. However, this was the beginning of a long and tragic descent into isolation, neglect, and ultimately, death. The last time anyone outside the family saw Lacy alive was when she was around 15 years old. After that, she seemingly vanished from the world, hidden away behind the walls of her parents' home. Neighbors noticed her absence and began to ask questions, but Sheila and Clay Fletcher would brush off their concerns, saying that Lacy was reclusive and preferred to stay inside. Over time, people stopped asking. But what was really happening inside that home was far more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. On January 3, 2022, Sheila Fletcher made a frantic call to 911. She told the dispatcher that her daughter had stopped breathing and needed medical assistance. When first responders arrived at the Fletcher home, they expected a routine medical emergency. Instead, they walked into a scene straight out of a nightmare. Lacy Ellen Fletcher, now 36 years old, was found dead in the family's living room. But this was no ordinary death. Lacy's body was discovered sitting upright on a couch, fused to the fabric by her own bodily fluids. The scene was so horrifying that it left even the most experienced paramedics in shock. Lacy was covered in sores, her skin was ulcerated and infected, and her emaciated body weighed only 96 pounds. The stench in the room was overwhelming, an unbearable combination of human waste, decay, and neglect. Lacy's body was so severely decomposed that it was immediately clear to investigators that she had been sitting in that spot for an extended period of time, years, if not longer. The couch had essentially become her prison, her tomb, and the conditions in which she was found were beyond anything most people could comprehend. Her lower body was completely covered in ulcerated sores that had penetrated through her skin and muscle tissue, exposing bone in some areas. These sores, known as decubitus ulcers or bed sores, are usually the result of prolonged pressure on the skin, often seen in bedridden patients who do not receive adequate care. The most horrifying aspect of Lacy's death was the realization that she had been left to suffer in unimaginable conditions for years, trapped on that couch in her own waste. The autopsy would later reveal that Lacy had been sitting in the same position for so long that her muscles had atrophied and her skin had literally fused to the fabric of the couch. Her body was riddled with infections from the untreated sores, and she was severely malnourished, with barely enough body fat to sustain her vital organs. But what was even more shocking was the level of sheer indifference shown by her parents. Despite living in the same home, despite being just feet away from her, They allowed her to waste away in plain sight. Lacy was surrounded by filth. Feces, urine, and garbage were piled around the couch, creating an unbearable stench that should have been enough to alert anyone of the danger she was in. Yet, day after day, week after week, year after year, Sheila and Clay Fletcher ignored the signs that their daughter was in desperate need of help. Investigators were baffled by how such extreme neglect could occur without intervention. They questioned how it was possible for Lacy to be left in such a state for so long without anyone noticing or reporting it. The Fletchers claimed that Lacy had chosen to remain on the couch, that she had refused to leave her spot, and that they had done their best to care for her. But this explanation was met with disbelief and outrage. How could a parent allow their child to suffer in such conditions? Why didn't they seek help? These questions became central to the criminal investigation that followed. As the investigation continued, more horrifying details began to emerge. The condition of Lacy's body indicated that she had been in immense pain for a long time. The pressure sores on her body were so deep that they had reached her bones. In some areas, the skin and muscle tissue had rotted away entirely. These sores, usually preventable with basic care, were clear indicators that Lacy had been left in the same position for years without being moved or properly cleaned. The autopsy report confirmed what investigators feared. Lacy's death was the result of severe medical neglect. She had died from a combination of chronic malnutrition, acute infection from the bed sores, and sepsis, a life-threatening condition that occurs when the body's response to infection causes widespread inflammation, leading to tissue damage and organ failure. The report also noted that Lacy had been suffering from severe dehydration and was covered in feces and urine, indicating that she had been left to sit in her own waste for an extended period of time. Further examination revealed that Lacy's muscles had wasted away to the point where she could no longer move her limbs. Her legs were tucked under her body in a fetal position, frozen in place by years of immobility. The combination of malnutrition, dehydration, and lack of movement had caused her muscles to contract permanently, making it impossible for her to straighten her legs or move from the position she had been left in. This condition, known as contractures, is common in cases of extreme neglect and is a clear sign that Lacy had been immobilized for a prolonged period. As horrifying as these physical findings were, the psychological torment Lacy must have endured was equally unimaginable. Experts speculated that she may have suffered from severe depression, anxiety, and even psychosis due to her prolonged isolation and the unbearable conditions she was forced to live in. The lack of social interaction, combined with the extreme physical pain she must have experienced, likely led to a complete mental breakdown, leaving her unable to seek help or even cry out for assistance. The Fletchers were soon charged with second-degree murder, a charge that reflected the belief that Lacy's death was not just a result of neglect, but rather a deliberate and sustained act of cruelty. Prosecutors argued that Sheila and Clay Fletcher had a legal and moral duty to care for their daughter, and by failing to do so, they had effectively caused her death. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Photos of the scene, the autopsy report, and testimonies from medical experts all painted a picture of prolonged and unimaginable suffering. The defense, on the other hand, argued that Lacy had severe mental health issues that made it difficult for her parents to care for her, and that they had done their best under challenging circumstances. They claimed that Lacy had refused to leave the couch, that she had refused medical care, and that her parents were simply overwhelmed and unable to cope with her needs. But this argument was not enough to convince the jury, who ultimately found Sheila and Clay Fletcher guilty of second-degree murder. As the trial unfolded, the community was shocked by the sheer depravity of the case. Neighbors and acquaintances testified that they had rarely seen Lacy in the years leading up to her death, and that her parents had always given vague or evasive answers when asked about her well-being. Some neighbors reported that they had occasionally heard noises coming from the house, but nothing that suggested the horrific conditions inside. This revelation led to further outrage, as many wondered how such extreme neglect could go unnoticed for so long. The case of Lacy Ellen Fletcher is a tragic reminder of the consequences of extreme neglect and the importance of caring for the most vulnerable members of society. It is a story that has shocked and saddened people across the country, raising important questions about the responsibilities of parents, caregivers, and society as a whole. Lacy's death was not just a tragedy, it was a preventable one. If she had received proper care and attention, she might still be alive today. Instead, she was left to suffer in unimaginable conditions, her life cut short by neglect and indifference. In the aftermath of Lacy's death, there has been an outpouring of grief and anger, as well as a renewed focus on the issue of neglect and abuse. Many people have called for changes in the way that cases of neglect are handled, arguing that more needs to be done to protect vulnerable individuals like Lacy. There have also been calls for greater awareness and education about the signs of neglect and the importance of early intervention. Lacy's life and death have left a lasting impact on those who knew her and on the community of Slaughter as a whole. Her story is a haunting reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind closed doors, even in the most seemingly ordinary places. It is a call to action for all of us to be more vigilant, more compassionate, and more willing to speak out when we see something that isn't right. Her life was tragically cut short, but her story has the power to make a difference, to inspire change, and to prevent similar tragedies from happening in the future. Thank you for joining us on Sinister Macabre as we explore this devastating case. If you found this story as heart-wrenching as we did, consider subscribing for more deep dives into true crime, mysterious disappearances, and the darker sides of human nature. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and always remember, evil often hides in plain sight.